Episode 21, Part 13, Chapter 19. Chapter 19. The battle started quickly as the carry armor raised its crane-like shoulders above its head and then thrust out its pincer-like grabbers. Despite being so large and clunky, it moved surprisingly fast, and the others were forced to jump back out of reach to avoid being skewered by the massive grabbers. All except Cloud, who dodged the grabbers as they slammed into the ground and darted forwards. With the Buster sword ready in his hands, the swordsman leaped into the air. He raised the sword above his head and brought it down hard on the carry armor's right shoulder. The blade cut deep into the metal, but did not go deep enough to cause any severe damage. The carry armor's metal plating was thick and strong, and because the initial attack had forced him to dodge and run, Cloud had not been able to build up enough momentum that would have allowed him to cleave the robot in two. Standing on the robot's shoulder, Cloud wrenched his blade free. He was about to launch another downward strike when he felt the robot shudder, and its head turned to face him. The laser barrel glowed hotly. Hurriedly Cloud leaped backward, just as the laser fired a single, thin beam of hot energy where he had been standing. The beam carried on and hit the ceiling at the other end of the dock. Cloud landed behind the carry armor. Lowering his blade, he looked up at the ceiling where the beam had hit. A large hole about a meter wide had been burned into the metal, revealing the numerous pipes that were channeling Mako and electricity throughout the complex. Cloud dreaded to think what would happen if that laser managed to pierce the reactor's outer wall. Still, he had other things to worry about. Behind him, the submarine's engines began to hum. Any moment the submarine would submerge into the water, taking Reno and the huge materia with it. If that happened, they were, well, sunk. They needed to finish the carry armor off or disable it long enough so that he and the others could prevent the submarine from leaving. He turned his attention back to the battle at hand. The carry armor had managed to lift its arms from the floor and was now engaged in a heated battle with the others, who had attacked while its attention was focused on Cloud. He saw smoke and flames rise up from where Barrett had launched a fireball from his gun arm. He heard Vincent firing from some place out of sight, and saw Tifa zipping in and out of the robot's range, trying to launch devastating blows with her fists whenever she could find an opening. The carry armor swung its shoulders and slammed one of its grabbers into the ground. It connected with so much force that it dented the metal floor. The blow almost crushed Sid, who dodged it by falling back and rolling quickly out of the way. In that moment when the carry armor tried to raise its arm and regain its balance, Red 13 darted past and padded over to stand by Cloud. "What should we do?" he asked breathlessly. There was a bloody graze on the hound's left shoulder where one of the swinging grabbers had sliced him. Cloud raised the Buster sword and looked at the robot down the flat side of the blade. The carry armor did not seem to notice the two standing behind it. Its attention was fixed on the others, who were attacking from the front, and so it ignored him and the hound completely. Cloud closed his eyes and placed his hand against the blade of his sword. He focused his will on the lightning materia that was still equipped into the blade, and the second materia that allowed him to channel the other's energy into the weapon itself. It was a combination he had used ever since this journey had begun, and it had never failed yet. The materia began to glow faintly, and sparks of electrical energy began to crackle around them. "Keep it occupied." Red 13 tilted his head, confused. Then, seeing the crackling materia, he nodded in understanding. "I see. A diversion. Very well. Good luck, Cloud." The hound broke into a run and leaped over the robot's arm to rejoin the others. Cloud stayed where he was, continuing to focus his mind and will on the materia. The glowing light grew brighter and Cloud could feel the energy burn through the Buster sword's blade, but it was not strong enough yet. The carry armor's defenses were strong, it would take an enormous amount of power to break through them. So he continued to focus his will, driving every last ounce he could into the materia. Red 13 must have managed to inform the others of Cloud's plan, for the assault on the carry armor swiftly stepped up. The others attacked quickly, striking quick blows and then retreating to let the next person strike from another position, giving it little time to recover and counterattack. Red 13 darted between its grabbers as it tried to snatch the hound from the ground, while Sid and Kat used their equipped gravity materia to halt the robot in place, the materia not being strong enough to crush the metal. When the robot's attention was elsewhere, Tifa swept in to land a crushing blow to its legs, before darting out again to safety. Vincent and Barrett teamed up to fire at the robot's laser head, attempting to disable it before it thought to fire at them again. The robot swung one of its elongated arms just as Yuffie leaped in to attack. The metal grabber knocked the ninja aside, making her lose her grip on her razor ring and sending her spinning through the air. She landed in the water with a loud splash, followed by her weapon, which sank out of sight. The arm carried on swinging and struck Tifa as she ran in from the left to strike one of its legs while its balance was shifted. It came so fast she did not realize it was heading for her until it smashed into her and knocked her aside. The fighter hit the ground hard and lay winded, clutching her aching torso. The materia in Cloud's sword glowed brighter, until both balls glowed hot white. They flashed, and the blade became engulfed in pulsing waves of electric white light. The light that danced across the blade also flickered across Cloud's hand, but the energy could not harm the one who had summoned it. The hair on his arms and neck stood on end, charged by the static energy. Tearing his hand away from the blade, Cloud held the sword ready and charged forward. The carry armor, unaware of the assault that was coming from behind, reached out with its left arm. Tifa, still winded from the blow that had sent her flying, could not do anything as the pincers closed tightly around her torso and lifted her off the ground. The fighter struggled and kicked, but to no avail. Seeing Tifa caught through the corner of his eye, Cloud quickly thrust his sword high above his head, unleashing the electric energy before it could hit the carry armor. The electricity swept of the blade and dispersed into the air. Cloud carried on moving, and with a swift movement of his arm altered the attack angle of the blade. He had been aiming for the back of the robot's head, but instead struck the joints that connected its left shoulder to its body. The residual lightning energy left in the blade was enough to break through the metal and tear straight through the joints, dismembering the arm from the rest of the body. That arm fell straight to the ground, taking Tifa with it. Quickly, Barrett ran to help her. Without its left arm to balance it, the three thin poles that supported the carry armor's weight were unable to keep it upright. The robot staggered and tottered until the weight of the remaining right arm pulled it sideways. Two of the legs came off the ground and flailed helplessly in the air. The robot continued to tilt over, until its right arm got caught on the ground, acting as a balance and keeping it from falling over completely. Although it could no longer use its arms to attack, the carry armor still had its lapis laser. Unfortunately, falling off balance meant it could not aim properly, and when it fired at Cat it missed by a good meter and hit the wall behind him, burning another large hole. Vincent raised his gun and fired a single, precise shot into the laser barrel. The bullet tore through the laser's mechanics, and smoke began to pour from the inside. Seconds later the laser exploded, and more smoke billowed into the air. The robot was now defenseless, unable to do anything other than wave its two legs pointlessly in the air. Cloud came to stand behind it. Focusing his will, he called upon the power of the lightning materia once more. The materia glowed brightly, and electricity swept across the full length of the blade. The lightning hissed and crackled as its bolts flickered across the metal. Cloud raised the sword above his head, and then brought it down on the robot's unguarded head. The sword cut right through the head. The blade severed the pipes that supplied Mako to the laser and to the rest of the body, and light green liquid spilled out and onto the floor. The electricity surged through the robot's interior, and the carry armor shuddered as though having a fit. Its right arm slipped and the robot fell to the floor. It shuddered a few seconds more before lying still. It was over. Cloud sheathed his sword and turned to face the submarine. Or rather, he turned to face the space where the submarine had once been. The red submarine had escaped during the fight, submerging into the water and heading out into the ocean. Cloud cursed loudly. Damn! The submarine? The huge materia! Tifa, now free of the grabber, came to stand beside him. She had a large red mark on both her arms where the grabber had nipped her, but otherwise she seemed to be unhurt. We have to go after it, she said to him. But it's already in the water, pointed out Red 13. Cloud looked around, trying to find some way by which they could go after the submarine. He refused to believe that after coming this far they could lose the huge materia now. No matter what, they had to catch that sub. His eyes settled on the second submarine still stationed at the other end of the dock. The sub was guarded by a number of Shinra soldiers, who were standing around and watching them with interest. Cloud signaled to the others, and they nodded back in understanding. They ran towards the sub. Seeing the rebels heading their way, the soldiers' interest turned to fear. They scattered and hurried towards the sub, hoping to escape before the rebels could reach them. A number of soldiers disappeared down the hatch into the sub itself, while 4 remained outside to guard the hatch and prevent the rebels from entering. These soldiers stood on the ramp leading up to the sub, their machine guns ready. Why, you? One of the soldiers managed to sputter. You're not taking over this ship, shouted another soldier. Despite his brave words, the machine gun in his hands shook almost violently. The 2 soldiers behind him nodded in agreement and raised their sights to their eyes, preparing to fire. The rebels did not stop or slow down, but continued to charge at the soldiers. Seeing this, the soldiers hesitated and looked briefly at one another. Then they made up their minds and opened fire. Cloud drew his buster sword as the soldiers opened fire. The bullets were poorly aimed, and they bounced harmlessly off the blade. A ball of crystallized ice flew past him and hit one of the soldiers standing on the upper half of the ramp. The soldier was thrust back towards the railing. He grabbed hold of his comrade for support, but only ended up dragging the other soldier with him. Both soldiers fell over the railing, landing in the water with a loud splash. The two remaining soldiers ceased firing and charged forward to meet the rebels head-on. Cloud spun and slashed his blade in a powerful downward arc, and the first soldier fell instantly. The second soldier could not stop in time and met Cloud's sword on its second arc. The blade ripped the machine gun from his hands and sent it skidding across the ground, with a deep gash cut into the barrel. Before Cloud could raise his sword for a killing strike, Cat Shi jumped onto his back and then leaped at the soldier. He smashed his megaphone into the helmet's glass visor, breaking it into pieces. The soldier cried out and clutched at his face as blood dripped down his hands from his wounded face. Cat dropped down behind him and hit the back of his knees. The soldier fell to his knees and then onto the floor. Cat brushed the remains of the glass off his paws. Turning to the soldier, he smirked in satisfaction. He then looked up as the others began running past him and up the ramp that connected to the submarine. The cat started to call out in protest when the Mog scooped him up with one large fist and then hopped after the others, leaving the wounded and floundering soldiers to their misery. The sub's hatch was left open, forgotten by the soldiers in their hurry to escape. Cloud was the first to reach the hatch and knelt beside it, peering inside. He caught a glimpse of movement in the corridor below, as well as the sound of hushed whispers. Cloud looked up at Barrett, kneeling across from him and also looking down into the sub. The former resistance leader nodded. Cloud returned the nod and flexed his wrist, readjusting the sword hilt. He took a breath and then dropped down through the hatch. He landed in the corridor between the main control room and the engine room. 3 soldiers were stood waiting here, as Cloud had suspected. As he dropped into the corridor, the lead soldier drew a baton from his side and swung it at him. Cloud swiftly raised the buster sword and blocked the blow with the flat side of his blade. The two stood together, locked in an impasse. The soldier pushed his baton against the blade. "You want the sub?" he said through gritted teeth. "Just try and take it." Cloud frowned. Seeing the dark look on the swordsman's face, one of the other 2 soldiers turned to their commander. Sir," he said cautiously, keeping his eyes on Cloud. "Maybe we shouldn't piss them off." The commander didn't listen and continued to push his baton against the sword. He shuffled forward, trying to force Cloud off balance and give him the opportunity to strike. Behind the visor, Cloud could see the soldier sneering at him. Scowling back, Cloud pushed back, fighting to keep his balance. It was difficult, for the corridor was tight and cramped, and the floor beneath him vibrated with the roar of the engine, making him feel nauseous. Behind him came a loud thud as Barrett finally dropped down into the corridor to lend a hand. The sudden impact of his bulk made the floor shake, and the 2 soldiers stepped back in alarm. Then they recovered, drew their batons, and charged at him. Barrett ran to meet them. He drew back both of his great arms and then thrust them out. He slammed his fist hard into the gut of one oncoming soldier and his gun arm just as hard into the gut of the other. The 2 soldiers choked at the impact, and the sound of cracking could be heard as more than one rib was broken by the crushing blow. Barrett kept on pushing and hurled the 2 soldiers away from him. They flew back and smashed into the far wall on either side of the door leading to the control room. They sagged onto the floor. Only one of them tried to get up, but instantly passed out from the pain. The commander turned his head and stared in open-mouthed astonishment. Cloud took advantage of the distraction to pull back his sword, and the soldier keeled forward. Before he could recover, Cloud brought up his knee and caught the soldier firmly beneath his diaphragm. The commander coughed and dropped his baton. He staggered backwards and walked right into Barrett, who gave him a quick blow to the back of his head. The commander fell to the floor. Cloud twirled the buster sword behind him and sheathed it. While Barrett dragged the unconscious soldiers to the middle of the corridor, Cloud went back to the hatch and signaled up at Vincent to say it was safe for them to come down. Barrett finished dragging the last soldier and dumped him brusquely on top of his comrades. The commander, at the bottom of the pile, groaned beneath the weight. Leaning over, Barrett gave him another bash on the head, more gentle this time, and the commander fell silent once again. "Come on, Cloud," said Barrett, standing upright. "Follow me." He turned his back on Cloud and the soldiers and stomped off towards the control room. Abruptly, he stopped and scratched his chin, remembering something.
Dem man. What they?
Behind him Cloud rested his hand on his hip and waited for him to continue. Barrett scratched his chin a moment longer and then turned to face Cloud, a large grin on his face.
Hey yo. Remember I was the leader first, man. Yo. We come a long ways since we got on that train. Lots of things changed. This and that.
Turning away, he stumped off towards the control room. Cloud watched him go, confused, wondering what had brought that on. He felt a light tap on his arm and turned to Tifa, who was standing beside him. She smiled and gave him a wink. Cloud smiled and shrugged, shaking his head. Let Barrett have his moment of reminiscence if he wanted to. But Barrett was right about one thing, things had definitely changed since the day they met. Stepping over the soldiers, Cloud and the others followed Barrett into the control room. There were yet another 3 soldiers waiting for them in the control room. One of them Cloud recognized as the officer from when they had first arrived in Jinan, and he posed as a Shinra soldier in order to sneak on board the boat to Costa del Solution. Though he could not see their faces, Cloud guessed that the soldiers standing with the officer were the same ones he had trained with for Rufus's inauguration parade. The Shinra officer's eyes widened as he saw the rebels and the weapons they carried with them.
No, no. This is terrible.
He cried, and ran back to his comrades.
We don't have much time left,
said one of the soldiers. His trembling hands squeezed the butt of his rifle tightly.
I don't want to die.
The other soldier did the same.
There's still so much I want to do. I never even got to do my special victory dance in battle. All right, said the officer. Then make this your first victory. Go on, show 'em. Yes, sir. Remember your last training. Begin. Yes, sir.
The 2 soldiers raised their rifles and twirled them over their heads. The officer, encouraged by the new confidence he had inspired in his subordinates, turned back to Cloud and the others.
I'm back,
he announced.
And now I got no regrets.
Lifting his training whistle to his lips, he blew on it sharply.
ATNTAC. HMMMM.
Cloud crossed his arms. Though the order to attack had been given, and though the 3 soldiers appeared to be awash in new confidence, none of them actually moved. They just stood there, waiting for Cloud and the rest to attack. Cloud looked back over his shoulder to judge the state of his friends. They had been forced to fight many battles to reach this point, and were beginning to tire. They could probably handle these 3 soldiers, but it seemed foolish to fight them unnecessarily, especially when the enemy themselves didn't have the heart for it. He released his grip on the sword hilt and looked back at Vincent.
Capture them, he said.
The gunman nodded and walked forward silently, loading 3 bullets into the barrel of his gun before pointing it at the soldiers. Barrett looked like he was about to protest, but was silenced by a dark look from Cloud. Seeing the gun barrel pointing their way, the 3 soldiers quickly lost any and all of the confidence they had managed to muster for the fight. The 2 soldiers at the rear lowered their guns and followed their commander to the side of the control room, out of the way of Cloud and the others. Vincent stood nearby, keeping guard. Cloud walked to the center of the control room. Suddenly, he stopped and looked around at the walls and consoles, the beeping lights and scrolling screens. His throat became dry and tight. When he tried to swallow, it was almost painful. He turned away from the console and back to the others. They watched, confused, as the swordsman began to dance from foot to foot.
Someone?
Please, said Cloud, his face paling.
I'm sorry, I can't take it anymore. The lack of space, the shaking, the roar of the engine.
There came a loud hum from the engine room, and the subfloor vibrated once again. The movement sent shockwaves of nausea right up to Cloud's stomach. His face went sheet white and he dropped to his knees. He was not the only one. Yuffie was also suffering from the unsettling motion, hopping on the spot with her hands clamped over her mouth. Barrett glared down at Cloud angrily.
Stop your blubberin'!
He snapped without sympathy.
How we gonna move this without you? What are we going to do?
Said Tifa.
We stole a submarine and can't pilot it.
She would not admit it to anyone else, but she was slightly relieved to see Cloud like he was. This was more like the Cloud she remembered. Sid pushed his way past Cloud and Barrett and walked right up to the control panel. Leaning over, he examined it closely. The controls were, naturally, very different to those he was used to seeing in his old airplane, the tiny Bronco, or those found in the rusted old Shinra No. 26. Still, he mused, it wasn't completely indecipherable.
Hunk-a-junk.
The pilot muttered disdainfully.
Just gotta do this.
He punched a button on the control panel, and the submarine sprang into life. The whole sub shuddered, and there was a deep roar from below as the engines powered up and began to move the sub slowly away from the dock. A red light flashed in the control room. Satisfied, Sid turned to Cloud.
See? Now you take over.
Startled by the unwelcome motion, Yuffie clutched at her stomach and keeled over.
Hey! It's movin'.
The sub jolted as it scraped past the edge of the dock. The ninja jumped in fright and turned slowly in a circle, trying to stay the waves of nausea that threatened to overcome her.
Man, this sucks. Cloud, do something.
Cloud opened his eyes. Steadily, he rose to his feet.
Hey, you're right.
He said.
I do feel a little better driving.
He nodded his head, and clenched his fist.
No sweat. Just leave everything to me.
Tifa clapped her hands.
You can do it, Cloud.
Cloud climbed into the pilot's seat. The seat was made of leather and was well worn, he almost sank into it. Shifting to the edge of the seat, he pulled on the seatbelt and clipped himself in. He then scanned the console before him.
Well, now what?
Laid out on the console were numerous dials and buttons, switches, and screens that rolled with information that was almost impossible to understand. Directly in front of him was a steering wheel, obviously used to maneuver the sub through the water. To his left were knobs used to control the internal tanks that took in and discharged salt water, controlling the sub's ability to dive or ascend. By those was a gear stick with a red button inlaid at the top. Beside it were 3 buttons, labeled Load, Cancel and Error. The purpose of this gear stick was clear, it controlled the sub's military arsenal.
Everything seems set,
said Cloud to himself. His attention was then drawn to a single button close to the steering wheel, labeled On-Screen Display.
This switch?
Asked Cloud to himself, pushing the button. It beeped and a computerized voice spoke from the console.
Main screen, on.
The display screen went dark. It then lit up again, but instead of showing data, it showed the view outside of the sub. He could see the dock as the sub moved steadily away from it, heading out into the water. The soldiers they had fought there were gathered on the edge of the walkways, watching silently. One shook his rifle angrily. Cloud took hold of the steering wheel and maneuvered the sub away from the dock. It swerved right, and he could see the crackling remains of the carry armor still lying on the pathway. Once clear of the dock, Cloud pulled on one of the knobs that operated the internal tanks. The external grids in the side of the sub opened up, allowing salt water to flood the tanks. The submarine began to slowly submerge beneath the water. They watched as the water level rose around them, filling the display screen. The moment the sub was underwater, the depth sensors activated and the camera changed to a mode more suited to underwater viewing. When completely submerged in the water, Cloud turned the submarine around and began to search for the hatch that would lead the sub out into the ocean. He found it quickly enough. It was still open from when the red sub had escaped during their battle with the carry armor. Cloud headed for that hatch. It was now a case of finding the escaped red submarine and reclaiming the huge materia. And, as Kat had so helpfully reminded them early, hope they didn't run into weapon in the process. End of chapter. Episode 22, Part 13, Chapter 20. Chapter 20. Controlling the submarine was not as difficult as it first seemed. They got off to a shaky start as Cloud got used to the controls, maneuvering the submarine towards the hatch. Once they were out of the dock and into the ocean, travel became much easier, and they headed on their way. The water was quite smooth this far down, with little disturbance from the tide above. The Mako-powered engines propelled the submarine through the water at a steady speed, and it wasn't long before they left the underwater reactor behind. Once they were sure that they were not going to be followed, they began their search for the red sub. Tifa went to the control column at Cloud's left side and sat down. Laid out before her were the controls for operating the sonar. She examined them closely. The sonar was already active, set currently at a mere 20 kHz for a quick scan of the immediate area around the sub. The sonar blipped as it picked up a few small fish swimming a small distance above the sub. The data came up on the screen beside her, showing the species name, how far it was from the sub, and if it posed a threat. Sid stood behind her and watched as Tifa looked over the controls, trying to figure out how to adjust the sonar settings to scan a wider area. Though he was an airplane pilot, Sid had at least some idea of how the sub worked. The controls were not that dissimilar from those of a plane, albeit one a little more advanced than his beloved tiny Bronco. Still, they were not as advanced on those of the Highwind, and he already knew those controls inside and out. Reaching over Tifa's shoulder, he turned one of the dials and adjusted the sonar settings from 20 kHz to 50 kHz. The sonar blipped again. Sid and Tifa leaned forward to see what it had picked up. They were disappointed, all it had picked up was more fish. Then, there it was. The red sub suddenly appeared, a large, white blip on the sonar. Sid and Tifa leaned forward again and looked at the readout. There was no doubt about it, it was the enemy submarine. There was the name, model number, its port of origin. Even a list of its commanding officers. Until then the sub had been invisible to the sonar. It had been hidden behind a rising column of rock jutting up out of the ocean floor, caused by the plates that moved deep below the crust of the planet. The sub was only detectable now because it had come out from behind the column and was moving slowly across the seabed. It appeared to be going west, and was heading into a valley of similar rocky rises.
Got it, said Tifa, analyzing the figures. It's right ahead, about a quarter of a mile away. If you keep on this course, you should see it before it heads into the valley.
Cloud nodded silently and moved the ship in the direction of the valley. It wasn't long before the sub came into view. Cloud spotted it as it drifted across the ocean floor, using the shadows created by the rising rock as camouflage. It became visible only when it came out of the shadow and into the faded sunlight. He watched as the sub turned and headed deeper into the valley. Cloud also moved their submarine into the valley. It was a tight fit in some places, for the rugged columns of rock were cramped tightly together. Many looked like they had been blown apart, for chunks of rock had been broken off in places, gathering on the seabed as piles of rubble. Looking at them, Cloud couldn't help but wonder what caused them. Mines, maybe? He wouldn't have put it past Shinra to litter the seabed with mines, blowing up the ocean floor in their search for an area abundant in Mako. There was another option, which he didn't want to consider, and that was weapon. As the shadows of the columns fell over the sub, Cloud looked over his shoulder and gestured to the console to his right. Vincent nodded and calmly went over to it, leaving the guarding of the 3 Shinra soldiers to bear it. The soldiers eyed the big man and his metallic arm warily, not even daring to breathe too loudly. The right-hand console monitored the sub's weaponry, as well as the status of the engines. It was possible to control the weapons from Cloud's console, but with the swordsman too busy trying to keep the submarine from crashing into the rising walls of rock, it was necessary for someone else to handle the weapons. Vincent took a moment to look over the controls. He was able to figure out which buttons loaded the torpedoes into the loading bay, and which ones fired them. The gunman then began to fiddle with the dials, targeting the red sub.
Ready,
he said gruffly. Cat She stood behind Cloud and looked up at the screen nervously.
Be careful, Cloud,
the cat said with a tremor in his voice.
They know that we're here, watch out for their torpedoes. I know that,
said Cloud shortly, too busy concentrating on maneuvering the sub between the rising columns. It was difficult, the columns were so tightly crammed together that they risked scraping the sub against the rocky walls and damaging the exterior. When they were going through this cramped space, it was difficult to get a clean shot at the other sub. Without a clear shot they risked hitting the columns and burying the sub and the huge materia forever at the bottom of the ocean. The red sub was also having difficulty moving through the rocky landscape. It had slowed down greatly and was moving at a steady pace across the seabed. It was headed towards another of the rising columns, hoping to use its shadow to hide itself from their sight. Cloud followed, keeping the sub at a safe distance above them. The Shinra sub went around the rocky pillar and out of sight. Tifa leaned over the sonar. As long as the sub was behind the pillar it was invisible to the sonar, but she kept her attention fixed on every blip, ready to detect it the moment it reappeared. She waited as Cloud moved the sub in the same direction, towards the rocky pillar. Suddenly there was a blip on the sonar. Before Tifa could even raise her head to call out a warning, the Shinra sub reappeared from where it had disappeared behind the pillar and fired a torpedo at them. Acting quickly, Cloud punched the controls and forced the submarine into a steep dive. The nose dipped rapidly as the sub began to descend. All those without seats tumbled forward, and clutched at the nearest available handhold to keep from falling onto the floor. Yuffie swore obscenities under her breath and clutched at her queasy stomach, vowing never to ride in another boat as long as she lived. The submarine dived just in time. The torpedo whizzed by overhead and struck the column of rock behind them. The resulting explosion was so loud it could be heard and felt inside the sub. The submarine shook violently, thrown by the shockwaves caused by the blast. The loose rock fell over the sub and hammered into the hull. The noise was loud and deafening, resounding throughout the sub. More than one person in the bridge looked up in alarm, fearful of the sub's hull being damaged by the falling rock. Many small chunks of rock fell onto the display screen and stuck there, making it difficult to see anything that was ahead. Cloud did not hang around to see if any larger chunks of rock would fall onto the sub. He punched the accelerator and the sub plowed forward. When the rocky pillar had been destroyed, a few chunks of rock had crashed into the bow of the sub. They hit the electromagnetic transducers that emitted the sonar's audio frequency, temporarily knocking it out. It finally came back online as the ship surged forward, and as soon as it did, Tifa spun around in her chair and shouted out to Cloud,
"Quick! Turn to the left!"
Cloud did not wait to ask questions and immediately pulled the submarine into a tight left turn. Once again, everyone without a seat was thrown to the floor as the sub swerved sideways, and Yuffie swore fervently. The sudden movement dislodged the rocks that were blocking the display screen, allowing them to see what had caused Tifa to give the order to turn, another rocky column directly ahead. The sub swerved out of the way of the column just in time. It passed by so close that the screen was filled with nothing but rock. Once clear, Cloud pulled the controls back to the right, and the submarine groaned in protest as it turned to the right, bring them around the opposite side of the column. He had no sooner done this when Tifa cried out again,
"Look out ahead!"
Another torpedo was heading towards them. The Shinra sub had anticipated their actions and had moved into position on the other side of the pillar, waiting for them to appear. As soon as their sub came into view, they fired, catching them off guard. Learning from his mistake last time, Cloud pulled the submarine into a rise. The submarine rose up, and though the torpedo swerved up to reach them, it was not agile enough to keep up with them. The torpedo scraped past the pillar and exploded, breaking the column into pieces. The shockwave shook the submarine and propelled it forward at speed, whizzing over the pillars and over the Shinra sub. Cloud used this sudden burst of speed to his advantage. He waited until their sub sailed over that of the enemies and then pulled on the wheel with all his strength. The engines gave a strained roar as they struggled to bring the submarine into a turn at such a speed. They fought back against the wheel, but Cloud held firm, forcing the sub to turn in a 180-degree angle so that it was now facing the Shinra sub and in firing range. The Shinra submarine seemed at a loss for what to do. Once they fired their torpedo, they had immediately put their engines into reverse, planning to slink back into the shadows and prepare for another surprise assault. So it came as a complete surprise when the rebels had used the shockwave caused by the blast to propel their own submarine forward, whooshing overhead and then swerving into an attacking position at their rear. The rebels could just picture the Shinra crew inside the vessel, running around in a panic, with the commander barking orders on deaf ears. The submarine slowed to a stop. Cloud's head snapped round.
"Fire!"
he ordered Vincent sharply. Vincent nodded and calmly flicked the switch that armed the torpedoes. He had already readied a torpedo in the loading bay in preparation for a quick assault. At Cloud's command, Vincent brought the enemy sub into his sights and fired. The torpedo was unleashed and zipped through the water towards the Shinra vessel. The other sub thrust its engines into forward gear and began to move forward just as the torpedo struck. Vincent's aim was perfect. The torpedo ripped through the Shinra sub's armored exterior and blew right through its primary engines. A stream of bubbles and watery flame erupted around the submarine, shielding it from view. The flames were quickly put out by the water, but the bubbles rose thick and fast as the air inside the enemy sub escaped. Inside the rebel sub, Cloud and the others watched nervously. The Shinra submarine then emerged from the shroud of bubbles. Using its secondary engines, it left the maze of rocky columns and headed upward as fast as it could go. The damage caused by the torpedo was clearly visible. There was a large hole in the rear of the submarine where the torpedo had hit, and the area around it was charred black. Air was still escaping, and now the submarine was racing towards the surface. Cloud pulled on the controls and brought the submarine around. He followed the Shinra sub as it sped towards the ocean surface. With its main engine out of commission, the enemy vessel was considerably slower. Cloud very much doubted it would even reach the surface before the water seeping inside it became too much and dragged it back down to the seabed. Just to make sure that did not happen, Vincent fired a second torpedo at the fleeing sub. The torpedo hit its mark perfectly, and the submarine's secondary engines exploded. More bubbles rose thick and fast from the point of impact. The submarine faltered and came to a stop, unmoving in the water. A number of pods began to fire out from the sides of the sub. Realizing that their vessel was doomed and their mission failed, the crew had decided to evacuate. For a moment Cloud wondered if he should order Vincent to take out the pods and prevent the crew from returning to Shinra, but he decided against it. They had abandoned their vessel, there was no point in killing them unnecessarily. As the last of the pods left the submarine and raced off through the waters away from them, the abandoned submarine finally lost the last of its power and began to sink back down towards the ocean floor. It left a column of bubbles in its way as the last of the precious air escaped. It was unlikely that anyone on board the sub had had the presence of mind to collect the huge materia before running to the escape pods. Cloud doubted even Reno, whose mission was to collect the huge materia, would have done so. He knew enough about the Turk to know that, although dedicated to completing his assigned mission, he would have willingly given up the huge materia once the situation became impossible. Reno would have seen no sense in staying on board and risking his life just to fetch the huge materia. Let the rebels have it, or let it sink to a watery grave. It would all be the same to Reno, and he would live to fight another day. Cloud let go of the steering wheel and leaned back in his chair. His fingers ached as he uncurled them from clutching the wheel.
Phew!
He said, sighing with relief.
We did it!
Flexing his fingers to reduce the tension, he turned to the others.
The huge materia should be at the bottom of the sea by now. Let's continue the search.
He turned back to the console. Just as he was about to lower the sub back towards the seabed, the intercom crackled and a voice spoke.
All Shinra submarine units, do you read? All Shinra submarine units, do you read?
Cloud stared at the console.
Must be from Shinra,
he said.
Report, number 2.
Tifa turned around in her chair.
Number 2.
She whispered.
I saw that written at the dock. They must mean this sub.
Probably trying to see if we have taken over one of their subs, Cloud thought.
All right, I'll do it,
he said. Everyone, including the 3 captured Shinra soldiers, fell silent as Cloud opened the communications channel.
This is Shinra number 2. Everything's normal.
There was a length pause, and everyone inside the submarine felt their hearts dance wildly within their chests. The tension of waiting for a response amplified every sound, the beeping of the consoles, the low creaking of the sub, and the faint roar of the engines, making them seem twice as loud as before. Did they recognize Cloud's voice? If they did, Shinra would not hesitate to sending a whole fleet of submarines to bring them down. Their attention was so fixed on the silence that when the response finally came they almost jumped out of their skins.
Roger. Your next mission is return to Junon Dock. We will transport the huge materia from the airport. Those without other assignments will report for guard duty. That is all. Over and out.
Cloud closed the communications channel. Around him, the others sighed in relief. It seemed that their infiltration of the underwater reactor and theft of the sub hadn't been discovered yet, despite the ruckus they had made. This worked to their advantage. The person on the intercom had said that the huge materia was being transported from Junon Airport. That meant that the huge materia now in Junon was the one they had collected from the Nibelheim reactor.
Junon Airport,
said Cloud thoughtfully.
We should make it if we hurry.
Though he hated the idea of leaving the huge materia they had worked so hard to obtain at the bottom of the ocean, it was a risk they were going to have to take. It was possible that the Shinra company wouldn't even try to retrieve it, and they could go back and collect it later when things quietened down. Making up his mind, Cloud looked back at the others.
Forget about the huge materia for now,
he said.
We're climbing.
He pulled on the lever that ejected the water from the tanks. There was a deep groan as the water was pushed out of the tanks and replaced by air. The submarine creaked as it became lighter and began to head back towards the surface, helped by the engines. As they rose higher, everyone groaned as their ears popped. Yuffie clamped her hands firmly over her ears and hopped miserably from foot to foot.
Climbing! Arg! My ears!
She cried shrilly. She hopped in a circle and stamped her feet on the floor.
Let me out, I hate this.
As soon as they reached the surface, Cloud directed the submarine to a small alcove close to the lower part of Junon. It was a suitable hiding place, it was private, close to the town, and practically invisible to the upper levels. They could hide the sub from Shinra and return at a later time when everything else was finished. The 3 captive soldiers were released once the sub was safely docked. They were warned once, calmly, by Cloud, and once, not so calmly, by Barrett, that if they returned to warn Shinra or reclaim the sub, then they would not be so lenient if they ever caught up with them. The soldiers took these threats to heart and immediately fled into the Condor Plains. Once that was done, Cloud and the others hurried into town. They did not waste time bargaining with the soldier guarding the lift. Instead, they just shoved him aside and forced their way in. They stood about anxiously as the lift made its way slowly up to the upper levels. They counted the seconds until the lift finally stopped and they piled out, not stopping as they ran to the airport. They were too late. The airship Galnica, one of Shinra's military transport units, was already beginning to turn down the runway. Its wingtips lowered and clicked into place, while its propellers gained in speed until the blades were nothing more than a blur. The airship then rolled forward towards the end of the runway. There was a moment when everybody held their breath as the Galnica rode off the edge of the runway and dripped low out of sight. Then the wings caught the wind and the ship rose back up into the air. Cloud and the others watched powerlessly as the airship headed away from the airport and out into the setting sun. Cloud stepped forward away from the others, watching as the airship flew away into the reddening clouds.
"Oh no! The huge materia!"
he said in dismay.
"Let's go after it!"
Barrett shouted.
"Where's that thing headed?"
asked Sid. Cloud turned to look at him, amazed that Sid had not worked that out yet. Shinra planned to use the huge materia to destroy Meteor before it could hit the planet. There was only one place in the world where Shinra could possibly go in order to launch such an assault on an entity that was not on the planet.
"Rocket Town, of course,"
he said. End of chapter. Episode 23, Part 13, Chapter 21. Chapter 21. Shinra were already hard at work preparing the Shinra No. 26 for launch by the time Cloud and his friends arrived in Rocket Town the following morning. Their mechanics could be seen crawling all over the old rocket, polishing the rusty metal, performing the necessary checks, and clearing the launch area of any useless debris. Despite being unused for a number of years, the Shinra No. 26 space rocket was still in very good shape. Sid's careful maintenance, which he had done every single day since the failed launch all those years ago, had ensured that the rocket was still operable and ready to launch at a moment's notice. Although the space program had been abandoned long ago, Shinra had clearly never forgotten about its old rocket. The townspeople had left their homes and gathered in the center of town. They watched as Shinra prepared the rocket, their faces showing expressions of both awe and unease. The old folk stood together and shook their heads, muttering about the foolishness of youth. The men watched with disapproval as the Shinra soldiers patrolling the foot of the rocket began to move the scaffold and various other items that were gathered at the foot of the rocket and throw them into the bushes. The children, eager to see what was going on, strained against their parents' hands. Cloud and his friends stopped at the back of the crowd and looked up at the rocket. It seemed that the Shinra were done with their preparations and were beginning to withdraw. The mechanics were now dismantling their equipment and climbing down the rocket, which meant that it was almost time to launch. Hurriedly they began to make their way through the throng of people, trying to reach the rocket.
"What's young President Rufus doing by gathering all those mechanics together?"
they heard one man mutter as they squeezed past.
"The Shinra serious about launching that piece of crap rocket?"
another man voiced, not too quietly.
"But why now?"
Sid felt his face burn hotly, angered by the man's words. The Shinra No. 26 was his pride and joy, next to the tiny Bronco. True, the rocket had never made it off the ground, but that wasn't the rocket's fault. It was Shara's fault. It was Shara who had shattered his dreams and left the rocket as a broken-down wreck. Still, the rocket was a symbol of his dreams, no matter how unattainable they were now. Nobody had the right to label it a piece of crap. The pilot was just about to turn around and say this to the man who had spoken out, but Vincent quickly grabbed him on the shoulder and dragged him forward. There would be a time and place to argue about the worth of the Shinra No. 26 in the eyes of its townspeople, but this was certainly not it. They finally reached the front of the crowd. There were no guards or barriers to stop them from going through, presumably Shinra thought the townspeople wouldn't be any trouble. So Cloud and the others walked straight on through, ignoring the loud murmurs of the townspeople behind them. There was a small group of soldiers gathered near the foot of the rocket aiding with the dismantling of the equipment. One of them looked over and dropped a pole as he spotted Cloud and his friends running towards them.
"Those terrorists are here!"
he shouted. The other soldiers dropped what they were doing and rushed for their machine guns. The first soldier suddenly dropped to his knees and clutched at his thigh as Vincent fired a shot before he could reach his weapon. The gunman tried to fire a second shot at the second soldier, but the soldier quickly ducked and rolled out of the way. Snatching up his machine gun, he turned and took aim. Yuffie was on him in a flash, bolting past Vincent to meet the soldier head-on. The ninja had lost her razor ring during the battle with the carry armor, but the resourceful members of the Highwinds crew had already managed to obtain a replacement for her, the Crystal Cross, bought from the weapon shop in Mideel before the town sank into the life stream. The ninja gripped one of the Crystal Cross's blades and slashed across the helmet of the soldier. The crystalline blades flashed brightly in the morning sunlight, almost blinding her. The tip of one blade cut straight through the soldier's helmet as though it were nothing but plastic. The soldier cried out in pain but did not let go of his gun, and after a moment's fumbling he raised it to fire blindly. Yuffie grabbed the gun and wrenched it out of his fumbling hands. She then kicked him swiftly in the head and threw the gun into the bushes. The third and final soldier raised his machine gun and fired at Tifa. Cloud dashed in front of her and blocked the bullets with his blade, which ricocheted harmlessly off. When the soldier paused to reload, Red 13 pounced on him. The hound clamped his jaws around the soldier's shoulder and twisted. The soldier cried out and fell backward beneath the hound's weight. Red 13 continued to bite and snap until the soldier finally stopped moving. The soldier with the wounded leg clambered to his feet. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a hand grenade. He was about to pull the pin when Cat Shi, charging forward on his Mog, leaped off and snatched the grenade out of the soldier's hands. The soldier stared at his empty hand. A heavy weight suddenly struck him squarely in the jaw, and with a sickening crunch he tumbled backwards. He lay still on the grass, his jaw broken. Barrett stood over the fallen soldier, flexing his good hand. Without waiting to clean up the mess they had made, they hurried on. 5 more soldiers were standing on top of a set of steps connected to the scaffold. Drawn by the sounds of battle, they had come down to see what was going on. They saw the rebels easily dispatch the other soldiers and saw them run their way. 4 of the soldiers, including the commanding officer, moved into formation at the top of the steps to intercept the rebels. The last soldier, overcome by fright, seemed more intent on sneaking back up the ladder and escaping into the rocket. The officer in charge stood amongst his comrades and pointed down at the rebels, who gathered at the bottom of the steps.
"Don't let them get any further,"
he ordered the soldiers.
"Everyone, attack!"
The 2 soldiers in front unsheathed their machine guns and charged forward. Tifa ran up the steps to meet them. Reaching out, she grabbed hold of both soldiers by their heads and brought them together with a loud clank, the helmets being crushed beneath the force. Tifa released the 2 soldiers, who fell straight to the floor. Cloud and the others watched in wide-eyed fascination as the young fighter picked up the 2 soldiers one at a time, lifted them high up over her head, and threw them over the side of the steps. They landed with a heavy thud on the muddy ground. The Shinra commander stared in wide-eyed horror as Tifa wiped her hands and then turned her attention towards him and his 2 comrades. She stood ready, her fists raised and jaw set, silently daring the soldiers to come for her.
"Erg, you're not going anywhere!"
shouted the commander angrily, shaking his fist at her.
Nowhere."
He corrected himself quickly. Half turning, he gestured to the 2 soldiers behind to follow him. One of them nodded and drew his gun. The other reluctantly pulled himself away from the ladder and stood beside his comrade, also drawing his gun. Escaping wasn't in the cards, it seemed. Tifa took a few quick steps forward and caught the Shinra commander before he could place one foot on the next stair. She slammed her diamond-studded fist deep into his gut. When he keeled over, she grabbed his shoulders, stepped aside, and threw him bodily down the stairs. The soldier clattered and clanged as his armor bounced off the metal stairs, until he finally came to a stop at the bottom. Catching sight of movement in the corner of her eye, Tifa quickly ducked down as one of the oncoming soldiers made a swipe at her. She ducked low and then rose, bringing up her fist in a powerful uppercut. The blow was so powerful that the soldier was lifted off the ground and thrown backwards, falling back against the rails and slumping to the ground. Tifa spun around to face the last soldier. Before she could strike, Sid ran up the steps and thrust out his spear, impaling the soldier on its pointy blade. The soldier staggered backward, staring at the pole that was sticking out of his stomach. He fell back against the stairs, his head rolling to the side, until he became still. Sid walked up the remaining steps. Stopping by the body of the dead soldier, Sid placed one boot against the soldier's chest and yanked the spear free. He then stepped over the soldier and went over to the ladder. He stopped beside it, looking up at the Shinra number 26.
"God damn it,"
he cursed, his brow creasing in anger.
"What the hell do they think they're gonna do to my rocket?"
He stared up at the rocket, and his hand tightened its grip on the spear. Suddenly the pilot slammed the butt of the spear against the floor, and the others jumped. Sid turned, glaring at Cloud with blue eyes blazing.
I'm outta here, Cloud. I'm gonna kick those fucking Shinra right out of my rocket.
Without waiting for Cloud's approval, the pilot hooked his spear behind him and began to climb the ladder in earnest. Tifa started to call out to him to slow down and wait for them, but Cloud caught her arm. She looked about to protest, but the swordsman simply shrugged his shoulders. Sid's attention was no longer on them. All he could think about now was his rocket. It would be pointless to try and stop him. Sheathing his sword, Cloud took hold of the rungs and began to climb the ladder after Sid. Barrett followed close behind him, along with Vincent. The rest followed. Red 13 had to leap from scaffold to scaffold in order to make his way up. Cat Shi was forced to leave his Mog behind, for it was much too big to climb the ladder and not agile enough to climb the scaffolding. The Mog hopped angrily as Cat climbed up the ladder without it, before it turned and hopped away, heading back to the airship. Sid reached the top of the ladder and looked around. 2 Shinra soldiers stood further down the platform, along with a tall man in a dark suit. Sid frowned angrily, recognizing the uniform of the Turks. He ought to have known that Shinra would send its lackeys to do its dirty work. Unhooking his spear, Sid climbed up onto the platform. The Turk and the soldiers were standing beside the open door that led into the rocket, talking. Sid gripped his spear tightly and walked forward. He whistled loudly to get their attention. It worked. The 2 soldiers looked up, and the Turk turned around to face him. It was Rude. The Turk raised one eyebrow as Cloud then climbed up onto the platform, drawing his buster sword and moving to stand beside Sid. Though the Turk's face was stoic and unreadable, he seemed almost surprised to see them.
You again?
Said the Turk. He cracked his knuckles meaningfully.
We will eliminate everyone who gets in Shinra's way.
The 2 soldiers came forward to stand on either side of the Turk and raised their guns. The weapons clicked as rounds were loaded into the barrels. Slowly and cautiously Cloud moved to stand in front of his friends, shielding them. He readied his sword and waited for them to attack. Rude watched as Cloud moved to protect his friends. He raised one eyebrow, the only reaction his otherwise poker-faced visage betrayed. Adjusting his shades, he stepped forward to meet Cloud's challenge. Their attention was so fixed on those rebels that were standing in front of them that no one paid any attention to Red 13. The Hound had been using the various bits of scaffolding littered about the rocket to make his way to the platform where Cloud and the others were now facing off against Rude and his soldiers. His path brought him up behind the 2 soldiers, who did not notice when he leaped from the scaffold to land silently behind them. Baring his fangs, he pounced on the soldiers, ripping and tearing any place that he could sink his teeth. Rude turned at the sound of the scuffle, and as soon as his back was turned Cloud darted forward and swung his sword. Catching sight of the movement through the corner of his eye, Rude turned back and swung his fist. His knuckles scraped across the side of the blade, making them bleed but also managing to knock the sword off course and missing his shoulder by inches. While Cloud recovered, Rude raised his other fist and gave Cloud a glancing blow to the side of his face. The swordsman accepted the hit and grabbed hold of Rude's wrist. He pulled the Turk towards and past him, throwing him into the path of Sid and the others while he carried on forward to help Red 13. Rude stumbled forward, startled by the way he had been so easily lured into Cloud's trap. Before he could think about recovering, he was grabbed once more, this time by the shoulders, and received a swift punch to his own face, dazing him. Sid tightened his fist and punched the Turk once again in the face. The pilot was so angered by this unwanted intrusion from Shinra that he forgot all about his spear and about the others, and instead proceeded to engage in a bare-knuckle fight with the Turk. Rude managed to break free of the pilot's grasp and raised his arms to defend himself from the blows, landing his own whenever he saw an opening. The 2 struggled on the platform, each trying to overpower the other. In one blow, Rude managed to knock Sid's goggles off his head. Rude's shades followed a few seconds later, clattering to the floor. At last Sid managed to subjugate the Turk and landed one final blow. The Turk teetered backwards, fighting to keep his balance. He coughed, and blood flecked his lips. His legs buckled and he dropped to his knees, groaning painfully.
Ugh. GH.
Rude tried to rise to his feet. He just about managed to stand before his strength gave out again and he fell back onto the floor. He lay there, staring up at the morning sky, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath.
They got us,
he managed to say, before his head rolled to the side and he lost consciousness. Leaving Rude and the 2 soldiers, who lay wounded or unconscious on the floor, Cloud and his friends hurried towards the rocket. The door leading into the old rocket had been left wide open, and so they barged straight in. Standing in the open doorway, they looked around warily for Shinra soldiers. A single Shinra officer was standing in the corridor. As Cloud and his friends burst through the door, the officer turned and stared at them in open-mouthed surprise.
You? Why are you here?
The startled soldier managed to sputter. He had to shout to be heard. The clanging of the mechanics working in the cockpit, combined with the roar of the engines, had dimmed any other sounds.
Rude of the Turks should have been here.
Too bad, said Cloud. Without looking back, he jerked his thumb over his shoulder towards the door.
Those guys are over there.
The officer followed his gesture and looked out the door. He could just about see Rude and the two soldiers lying motionless on the platform, dead or unconscious, he could not tell.
Oh man! The Turks, being done in like that.
Turning back to the rebels, he reached for his gun.
But, I won't let you through.
A single shot fired, and the officer crumpled to the floor with his gun still in its holster. Vincent placed his gun back into its own holster. That was the end of that. With no more soldiers left to block his way, Sid leaped over the body of the fallen officer and rushed to the cockpit. He ignored Cloud's calls for him to slow down and wait for them. When he reached the cockpit, he threw open the doors and stormed in. There were 3 mechanics inside, each with their backs to him, tinkering away.
Hey!
The pilot shouted, startling the mechanics.
What the hell were you guys doing?
The 3 mechanics stopped what they were doing fixing up the rocket ship's main control panel and turned towards him. Sid recognized them as mechanics from his own town. At the sight of him their faces lit up, and they smiled widely.
Hey!
One of the mechanics greeted cheerfully, pocketing his wrench. He stepped forward to greet Sid.
Just when I thought something was going on, you come back. Listen to me, Captain,
said another mechanic.
We're gonna launch this rocket.
Sid stared at the mechanic like he was speaking an unknown language, like the old spirits from the city of the ancients.
Hey! What are you talking about?
The third mechanic grinned widely, tapping his screwdriver against his thigh.
We're gonna load a materia bomb in this and blow up meteor. Our heart's gonna save the planet. Erg! Man, this is so cool.
Once more Sid blinked and stared at the mechanics. Inside him, his heart and his mind were racing wildly throughout his body, and his stomach churned. Were the mechanics telling the truth? Was Shinra really planning to launch this rocket, his rocket, into outer space and use it to blow up meteor? This hunk of junk, which he had nurtured and tinkered with ever since that day when his dreams of space travel were shattered, was actually going to go into space? Cloud stepped forward to reason with the mechanics.
Wait a minute.
He began. Before he could continue, Sid turned sharply and shot him such a sharp glare that the swordsman closed his mouth.
Shut up!
Snapped Sid.
Just shut the hell up!
Ignoring Cloud's shocked gaze, the pilot exhaled deeply and turned back to the mechanics.
How's the rocket?
He inquired, now much calmer. Cloud, not daring to speak up again, turned to Tifa and shrugged his shoulders.
It's pretty much okay,
said the first mechanic.
But...
The third hesitated, and his eyes shifted to the floor. The second mechanic finished for him.
We planned to run it into meteor on autopilot, but the most important device is broken. Broken?
Sid scratched his chin thoughtfully.
How's the repair going?
Here the 3 mechanics looked easily at one another. An uncomfortable silence fell. None of the mechanics spoke, as none of them wanted to be the one who broke the news to Sid. As Sid crossed his arms and tapped his foot irritably against the floor, the second mechanic braced himself for the blow and broke the news.
Cher's doing it.
He got the reaction he expected, as Sid threw his arms into the air in disgust.
Oh great!
He shouted, exasperated. The mechanics flinched.
What a bunch of wizards you guys are! She's gonna take a 100 years!
The 3 mechanics lowered their heads and stared at the floor. Sid let his arms drop to his sides and thought about the situation. It didn't take him long to come to a decision. He nodded his head and looked up at the 3 shame-faced mechanics.
I'll take over, he said, so don't worry about the autopilot.
He grinned widely as the mechanics stared at him in wonder.
Hey, go ahead. Go tell everyone.
The mechanics dared not dispute him.
All right, Captain,
they said.
Good luck.
They ran out of the door. When the mechanics had gone, Cloud went to Sid, his face dark.
Hey, Sid. What are you doing?
He demanded.
There are generations of knowledge and wisdom inside the materia. We're gonna borrow their powers and save the planet from Sephiroth. There's no way we can lose the huge materia. You understand that, right?
Sid paused in silence for a moment, before turning to Cloud. The pilot's blue eyes were wide and wistful.
Yeah, I understand,
he replied calmly.
I understand that materia is precious, and I also understand what you're thinking. But listen.
The pilot paused to look around at the others, all gathered in the cockpit of his beloved Shinra number 26. His expression hardened. He turned his gaze back to Cloud.
I don't give a rat's ass whether it's science or magical power. No, if I had to choose, I'd rather put my money on the power of science.
Sid spread his arms wide, gesturing to the array of buttons and panels, consoles and gizmos, and all the other various electronic devices that beeped and flashed throughout the cockpit.
Humans who used to only roam around on the ground are able to fly now,
he said, and his voice filled with awe.
And finally, we're about to go into outer space. Science is a power created and developed by humans. And science just might be what saves this planet.
He clenched his fist, and it shook.
I was able to earn my living thanks to science. So to me, there's nothing greater. Now quit your worrying about what Shinra's gonna do.
He finished sternly.
I don't want to regret not having done something later. But Sid. Shut the hell up.
Sid raged.
I don't wanna hear it.
Cloud shut his mouth again, sighing inwardly. Sid ignored him and looked around at the others.
Anyone who ain't involved, get the hell out of here.
Just as he finished speaking, the rocket gave a loud groan from deep below them. Sid and the others looked around in alarm as a loud hum reverberated throughout the rocket, and the ground beneath them quivered vigorously. There was a loud whoosh as vented steam was released to the outside, and every so often there was a loud pop, as though metal was heating up rapidly. The rocket ship's engines roared into life, deafening those in the cockpit.
What the hell?
Said Sid, confused.
What the hell happened?
In answer to his question, the intercom crackled, and an unwelcomingly familiar voice spoke cheerfully through.
Hey hey.
End of chapter. Episode 24, Part 13, Chapter 22. Chapter 22.
Hey hey.
Recognizing that annoyingly whiny voice, Sid's lip curled in disgust.
Palmer.
He shouted. He looked up and around the cockpit, trying to find the speakers that were projecting the voice.
What the hell did you do?
Somewhere outside of Rocket Town, Sid could picture the obese head of the space program sitting securely in a chair, with a stupid grin on his weaselly face.
They said they finished the autopilot,
his voice came over on the intercom. He chuckled.
So, I launched it. Goddamn Shara.
Sid kicked the floor.
Why'd she pick today to get fast?
The pilot ran over to the cockpit's main control panel where the mechanics had been working. Frantically, he began pushing buttons and turning dials, trying to override the Shinra number 26's launch system. His efforts proved fruitless. The controls had already been diverted from the cockpit to another location, probably wherever Palmer was currently based. Realizing that his efforts were in vain, Sid clenched his fists and slammed them against the console.
Damn!
He cursed.
Won't even budge. It's completely locked up. Hey hey hey.
Palmer's voice was still brimming with innocent cheerfulness and excitement.
Almost lift off. What they?
Exclaimed Sid. He looked up at the ceiling, still searching for the speakers, even though he knew he could not get to Palmer through them.
No countdown.
The pilot shook his head.
It just don't seem the same without it.
Cloud smacked his palm against his forehead. The lack of countdown was the least of their worries right now. There was no way they could allow the rocket to take off with the huge materia still on board, no matter what Sid said. It wasn't about science or magical power. The huge materia had incredible powers sealed away inside them, powers that would be essential to stop Sephiroth. Maybe even Meteor. Cloud looked to the doorway as Vincent re-entered the cockpit, after slipping out briefly when Palmer started talking to check the exit. The gunman looked at Cloud and shook his head. Cloud sighed, his fears realized. The exit was locked. Shinra had been expecting them and had used this chance to lure them onto the rocket ship. Now Shinra could get rid of them and Meteor in one blow. The overhead speakers crackled with interference from the engines as Palmer spoke once more.
Hey!
They heard him say eagerly.
Hey! Blast off!
Outside, the engines began to roar loudly. The external vents opened to release the billowing clouds of piping hot steam that was building up inside the engines, and it flowed down the side of the rocket like water. When the countdown reached 0, the 10 thrusters ignited and sent searing hot flames rushing into the ground. They tore up the grass and soil, ripping it apart and burning it to cinders. The land began to tremble violently by the sheer power the thrusters puffed out, and the rocket strained against the tall metal pillars that bound it to the ground. A giant cloud of smoke rose up around the Shinra No. 26 and spread out like a shockwave. The cloud, thick and smothering and burning hot from the blast, headed straight for Rocket Town. The townspeople had long since fled the blast zone, seeking shelter in their homes. The cloud hit one of the nearby houses and ripped through the building as though it was paper. The roof came off and smashed against the ground. The windows shattered, sending deadly shards of glass flying throughout the town. The walls, unable to stand the strain, came apart and were carried away by the cloud. A nearby tree suffered a similar fate as it was blown sideways, held in place only through the strength of its roots. Its leaves, however, were blasted away, leaving it bare. The cloud, undeterred, swept through the rest of town, covering everything with dust. The remaining bits of scaffold fell and clattered to the ground as the rocket shuddered and strained against the 4 restraining pillars. At last they gave way and pulled back, releasing the rocket. The Shinra No. 26 tilted sideways into the position it had held since its last failed launch, and for a moment it looked like the rocket would fall over completely. It didn't, and after a few unbearably long-feeling moments, the Shinra No. 26 began to rise up from the launch pad. The rise was agonizingly slow at first as gravity sought to pull the rocket back to the ground. In the end, the sheer power of the engines and the thrusters won out over the forces of nature, and the ship rose higher and higher until it was over the town and rising higher into the sky. A trail of smoke was left in its wake as it soared up into the sky. Rocket Town was no longer visible from above, engulfed in smoke. The rocket ship continued to rise higher, away from the Earth and higher up into the sky than any airship could. It reached the ozone layer. The air rushing past the rocket burned red as it plowed past, fighting its way through the ozone layer to get to the first reaches of space. Finally the rocket broke through, and the rocket emerged into outer space. And then... silence. Those inside the rocket stood still in silence, their breaths held fast in their lungs, for they dared not even breathe. The roar of the engines died down as the thrusters slowed down, until only the soothing hum of the engines far below them remained. The only other sound was that of the main console, which beeped every so often. Sid raised his head and looked up at the display screen. The view outside was utterly breathtaking. Outside there was nothing but a vast black ocean, glittering with stars. They did not twinkle like they did on the planet, but simply shone with majestic radiance. The pilot's jaw fell open and his eyes widened as the knowledge of what happened finally settled in.
I finally made it!
He whispered in awe.
Outer space!
He was not the only one who was overcome by the view. His friends were also staring up at the screen, watching as the external camera positioned on the rocket's side slowly panned around the rocket. Even Yuffie forgot about her motion sickness as she stared at a sight no other ninja in Wutai would ever see as the planet slowly came into view. They saw the vast oceans, the continents, the scattered islands, and the swirling clouds. That was their planet, their home, so many miles below. Sid took a deep breath and exhaled softly. He would commit this image, this moment, forever to his memory. It was possible he would never see this ever again, and he wanted to be sure he would remember this feeling until his dying days. Locking that image securely in his heart, he tore his eyes away from the beautiful view and looked down at the console before him.
Let's see, how's the course set?
He asked himself, scratching his head. He pushed a button. He then folded his arms and tapped his foot impatiently as he waited for the console to respond. The camera's view faded and a star chart appeared in its place. To the left was a large green circle that represented their planet. To the right, moving slowly across the screen, was a smaller red circle. That red circle was Meteor, a vast stain on the blackness of space. A dotted line appeared on the chart, extending from the planet and moving on an arced course towards Meteor. Watching this, Sid nodded his head.
Yup, it's headed for a collision with Meteor,
he confirmed, as the dotted line flashed at the point of impact, the center of Meteor. The star chart faded, and the camera returned.
Can't we do something?
Asked Tifa.
If it goes on, we're
She didn't finish her sentence. The external camera finished it for her, this time turning away from the planet and bringing up the view in front of the rocket. The large globe that was Meteor rolled into view, almost filling up the whole screen. At the sight of it, the others felt shivers go running down their spines. It was a chilling enough sight from the ground, where Meteor hung in the sky like a slowly growing sun. Up here in space, seeing it move, it was much more terrifying. The planet was bombarded by space debris all the time. Most people never saw or heard about them, simply because they were too small to be worth mentioning on the news. Most debris in fact burned up in the planet's atmosphere upon entry, but some were large enough to make it through and crash into the ground as a lump of space rock without doing any damage to the land at all. Meteor, on the other hand, was completely different. This rock was gigantic in size, dwarfing even Midgar, the largest city on the planet. It was what was known as a planet killer amongst scientists. Meteor would not simply land in a muddy field, perhaps in a small crater, and lie there for eons to come. Meteor would smash into the planet, and the resulting shockwaves of wind and fire would tear the planet asunder. Nothing would survive that impact. Even here, in the dark reaches of space, flame raged across Meteor's dark and rocky surface. Looking at it brought waves of despair and fear amongst the party inside the Shinra number 26, and so they turned their eyes from it. Sid turned his attention back to the control console. He pushed some more buttons, scowled, and then kicked the console.
That Dempalmer went out of his way to lock the autopilot device,
he informed them.
We might not be able to change course.
Another somber silence fell as those words sank in. Cloud looked up at Meteor once again, watching as the flames that moved across its surface fought to break away, like tendrils looking for something to hold onto.
This is the end,
Cloud whispered. Sid turned and looked at Cloud in surprise.
Hey? What the hell were you saying?
He asked.
You're still young, and you give up that easily? I'm not gonna crash into Meteor.
He turned back to the console, pushing another button.
Just watch.
The display screen changed once more, and Meteor thankfully disappeared from their sight. In its place appeared a view of one of the corridors in the lower bowels of the rocket ship. In the corridor stood what looked like a pod. Sid pushed another button, and data began to sprawl down the screen, revealing the pod's statistics. Sid looked at the data for a moment, and then smiled to himself. He turned to the others.
I keep an escape pod on the rocket just for emergencies like this,
he explained to the others. The pilot sounded much more casual now, acting as though being in space was a natural thing. He walked past Cloud to the wall and reached up to tap a code into a panel there. He then pulled on a lever.
I deciphered the lock code on the escape pod,
he added, turning back.
We'll bail right before we crash into Meteor. But, what are we going to do with the huge materia?
Red 13 asked. He lifted a hind leg to scratch behind his ear.
Are we just going to give it up?
Sid closed his eyes thoughtfully for a moment. Despite his bold words about science and power earlier, he didn't really care what became of the huge materia. He had achieved his dream, and that was all that mattered.
If you want the materia, do whatever you want.
He nodded his head towards a recess in the opposite wall, where a ladder stood.
The materia should be there after you climb the ladder.
Sid turned and looked at the ladder.
You sure?
He asked skeptically.
I dunno,
admitted Sid with a shrug.
I know what I said a minute ago.
The pilot raised his gaze to the ceiling, and the wistful look returned to his eyes as he recalled the feeling.
But maybe all I really wanted was just to go into outer space.
He looked back at his friends.
So, why don't you all do what you think is right?
Cloud met the pilot's gaze, and then finally understood. Going into outer space had always been the air pilot's dream. It was a dream he thought he had lost forever. When he realized that he finally had the chance to achieve that dream he had longed for, well, of course he'd do anything to make it happen. Now that he had achieved it, blowing up Meteor was next to meaningless. The swordsman smiled and nodded at Sid, before he went to the ladder in the recess and climbed to the chamber beyond. Sid's guess was right. There was a large chamber just above the cockpit, and it was here, luckily for them, where Shinra had stored the huge materia. The chamber was empty except for a secure glass case fitted into an advanced lock in the middle of the room. Pipes ran from all directions across the floor to the center, using Mako drawn from the engines to power the lock. The huge materia lay inside the glass container, resting on a small tripod. The materia glowed with innate energy, giving its immediate surroundings an eerie, mystical glow. Cloud walked up to the huge materia and peered inside. He could see his reflection, small and fragmented, in its rugged surface. Even locked inside a secure glass case, he could feel the huge power contained within it.
I finally found the huge materia,
he whispered, awestruck. He reached out with one hand and placed his fingertips against the glass. Small electrical charges rushed through the muscles of his hands, as the power locked inside fought for escape. Sid came to stand beside him and examined the lock closely. At the base of the lock was a keypad.
It's structured so that the lock can be opened if we enter the passcode from this control panel,
he said. He looked at Cloud, and was amused by the awe-filled way the young man was staring at the huge materia.
Hey, Cloud,
he said, not trying hard to hide his smirk of amusement.
You know how to use it, right? Every time it says enter passcode, push one of those buttons. If you punch in the right code, it'll unlock and you can get the huge materia.
Cloud caught sight of that grin and scowled, his cheeks flushing faintly.
So, what order am I supposed to enter the passcode in?
He asked hotly.
I dunno,
the pilot replied, shrugging.
Just try and punch in the code randomly.
Swallowing his irritation, Cloud tore his eyes from the huge materia and examined the keypad. As Sid said, it was simple enough to operate. The lock required a 4-digit code in order to release its precious contents. But what code would be the correct one? Realizing he had nothing else to lose, Cloud punched in the first code that he could think of. As soon as he had finished inputting the code, the glass case suddenly dropped about 1 inch deeper into the lock. A number of clamps rose up and fitted around the case, holding it firmly in place. A computerized voice spoke from the machine.
Passcode input error, unauthorized user identified. Protection system will activate in 3 minutes.
A clock appeared on a panel next to the keypad and began to tick down. Cloud glared up at Sid, who looked back at him with an innocent expression.
Seems like you missed the code,
he said. He ignored Cloud's scowl and carried on.
If we don't enter the correct passcode before the protection system activates, we won't be able to get the huge materia back.
Cloud cursed and turned back to the keypad, beginning to input numbers at random, trying to figure out the lock. Sid tried to help by offering advice, but it had been so long since he had used this locking system that he could not remember the code entirely, just bits and pieces. Each time Cloud put in the wrong code, the lock buzzed loudly, as though mocking him. As the timer ticked away their precious seconds, Sid grabbed his hair and yanked it until tears came into his eyes. The more time that passed, the further away the correct code seemed to move out of his grasp. Of all the times to forget. Just as the clock went past the 1-minute mark, Cloud put in another code and the lock suddenly clicked loudly. The timer flashed and then went blank. Cloud shuffled back away from the lock as the clamps released the glass case. The light went out and it rose, and the door silently slid open, releasing the huge materia.
Passcode confirmed. Identified as an authorized user. Unlocked. Alright, Cloud.
Sid cheered.
It's unlocked. Yup, my great advice saved the day.
He folded his arms and nodded his head, congratulating himself for his hard work. Around him the others looked at each other, hiding their smiles behind their hands. Cloud said nothing. He took the huge materia out of the case and looked down at it. The materia was warm, he could feel its power radiating through his palms. Carefully Cloud rose to his feet and handed their precious cargo to Vincent. The dark-haired gunman took it from him and, just as carefully, stored it away. They went back down the ladder and into the cockpit. From there, Sid ushered them out of the main door and down the corridor towards a second ladder that would take them down to the engine room where the escape pod was stored. Once they were all safely down the ladder, Sid took the lead again, urging them on. The first corridor they came across housed the Shinra No. 26's 8 oxygen tanks. The door on the 8th tank was slightly open, unable to close, and electricity was sparking all over it. Sid stormed into the corridor, followed closely by the others. None of them noticed the 8th tank and moved straight on, hurrying to reach the escape pod before the rocket collided with Meteor. The pilot, still in the lead, was just walking past tank number 8 when the electricity came into contact with the oxygen flowing inside it. Their oxygen ignited, and then exploded. The resulting blast was so violent that it shook the corridor down to its core, throwing everybody off their feet. There came a loud crash and an equally loud cry of pain. Smoke filled the corridor, blocking everything from view. At that time Shara was still hard at work inside the engine room. She had hidden inside the escape pod to evade the searing heat that filled the engine room during the launch. Once the heat had died down escaping through the vents, she exited the escape pod and continued with her maintenance work. She was just checking the temperature levels of the engines when a loud explosion suddenly rocked the chamber. Shara's head snapped around to the door, and her eyes widened as she saw wisps of smoke seep through the door. She dropped her clipboard and hurried towards the oxygen tanks. She knew this would happen. As the smoke began to clear, Cloud and the others saw the damage the explosion had caused. The oxygen tank had been blown apart in the blast, and the surrounding tanks were also dented and leaking precious oxygen. Debris lay scattered throughout the corridor, charred and smoking. Steam, tainted with the scent of Mako, poured from the broken pipes. Cloud went over to the tank and looked inside. It was a mess. Sid lay in the middle of the corridor. The blast had thrown him against the far wall and onto the floor. Part of the oxygen tank's door had also been thrown away in the blast and had landed on his leg, pinning him to the floor. The pilot, stunned, struggled to sit up. When his head cleared and he tried to pull himself free, a sharp, agonizing pain shot up his leg.
Gurg!
The pilot cried out.
My leg's stuck in the debris. Sid!
Cloud left the oxygen tank and ran to Sid's side. Tifa joined him, and together they tried to lift the broken door off the pilot's leg. It was much heavier than they expected, and it barely moved.
I can't!
Exclaimed Tifa, releasing the debris.
It's so heavy, I can't lift it.
Barrett started to come forward to help, but Sid waved his hand to usher them away.
Don't worry about me,
he said sternly.
Hurry up and go. If you don't hurry, the rocket's gonna crash into meteor.
Sid looked at Cloud earnestly, hoping that the swordsman would see sense and leave him behind. Cloud felt his throat tighten, torn. He already knew what decision he would make, without even asking the others. Fighting against the choking feeling, he met the pilot's gaze, level and steady.
I can't go without my friends,
he answered, before grabbing the door plate and once again trying to lift it.
You little shit. No time to worry about other people.
Cloud didn't listen.
I'm gonna do whatever I can,
he replied. He tugged again, his muscles straining with the weight. Tifa helped out too, grabbing an edge and trying to lift the plate even just a few inches off the floor. Barrett and Vincent joined them, adding their strength to the rescue effort. Sid stared through wide eyes as the four of them worked together to free him. Even with the four of them tugging together, the plate was extremely heavy and difficult to lift. With each tug the plate only moved a centimeter at a time. At this rate, the rocket would crash before they could get him free. Sid shook his head incredulously.
You're stupid,
he said, though his voice lacked the anger and irritation it had before.
You're really fucking stupid.
The four continued to work, huffing and puffing as they steadily began to drag the door along the floor. It was still painfully slow work. Sid raised his eyes and looked at the remains of the oxygen tank that had blown up. The irony was almost painful. Realizing this, the pilot held his head in despair.
Tank number 8 blew up,
he said gravely.
So tank number 8 really was malfunctioning? Shara, you were right. But...
Sid's fingers clenched and tears of despair formed in the corner of his eyes.
This is the end for me. Don't say that, Sid.
Sid's head snapped up. Shara was standing in the doorway, looking down at him. For a moment he thought he must have banged his head harder than he thought, for it was impossible that she could be here. Cloud and his friends stopped tugging on the plate and looked up at the Rocket Town engineer, just as surprised as Sid.
Hey, Shara.
Shara, on the other hand, did not seem at all surprised to see them. Deep in her heart, she had known that Sid would turn up once news about Shinra's plans to launch the space rocket spread.
I tagged along,
she said with a smile.
I'm coming to help you.
She moved a loose strand of brown hair behind her ear before walking over and kneeling beside Cloud. The engineer nodded at Cloud and the others, and the five of them together began to pull on the plate. It moved slowly, steadily, but it moved. Sid continued to stare.
You stupid motherfucker.
The pilot flushed hotly, and his hand rushed to cover his mouth. A guilty look passed over his face. After taking a deep breath, he finally apologized. Not just for swearing at her, but for all the years he had cursed and swore and treated her like she was garbage.
Sorry.
End of chapter. Episode 25, Part 13, Chapter 23. Chapter 23. Cheryl led Sid, Cloud, and the others through the engine room to the corridor where the escape pod was stored. As she opened the door, a wave of air that was still warm following the launch wafted over them. One breath was enough to parch their throats, and they had to pause for a moment to adjust to the hotness.
The escape pod is this way,
said Shara, stopping at the end of the corridor.
Please hurry.
She seemed unbothered by the dense, warm air that had left the others wishing longingly for something cool to drink. They braced themselves before entering the corridor, and followed Shara to the escape pod. There was only one escape pod on board the Shinra number 26, which was only designed to hold a very small crew. It was decided by Shinra officials at the time that only one pod was needed, since it was expected that in a crisis it would be the engineers who would escape, while the captaincy would go down with the rocket. Sid had never argued this point, but as they all piled into the escape pod, he wished that he had. It was a very tight fit. The escape pod was built to hold only a small handful of people, not the 9 people that it was trying to fit in right then. Shara entered first, followed by Cloud and Sid. The others began to pile in slowly behind them, trying not to trip over or tread on each other's toes, or paws.
Hurry,
Shara urged them.
I'm going to detach the escape pod.
Sid jumped off the last step and walked forward. He looked out of the window at the opposite end of the escape pod, where the inner wall of the rocket ship could be seen. The pod was actually attached to an inner panel inside the wall of the rocket ship. The panel would break away with the pod upon detachment, and then, once the pod was at a safe distance from the rocket, the panel would fall away and float into space.
Hey, Shara,
said Sid.
Does this pod really fly?
The others all snapped their heads around and glared at him. They had all assumed that, since Sid had mentioned the escape pod, that meant that it did work. Cloud sighed and shook his head. He was starting to believe that Sid was as selective with his information as Cat She. He looked down at the cat, sitting on Red 13's back. Cat looked back at him with a puzzled expression. Cheryl looked thoughtful for a moment, and then nodded confidently.
It'll be okay,
she assured the pilot.
I've been checking it till now.
Sid paused for a long moment. He scratched his head.
Then I'm relieved.
Shara's face flushed bright red in gratitude. She hurriedly lowered her head to hide her blush, and her hands played absently with her glasses.
Thanks.
They all took their seats. Some of them were forced to stand or squish together on the seats, sharing seatbelts. Though no one said it out loud, except for Red 13, who lost his temper. His tail was trodden on for the 4th time, they were all thankful Cat She had left his mog behind. Once they were all seated and secured, Shara instructed sealed the escape pod's door and began the detachment process. The escape pod shuddered, and there came the sound of a loud whoosh as the pod still with the panel attached was released from the rocket. Those inside the pod were overwhelmed with the sensation of being rolled, and they were thankful for their seatbelts holding them in place. There was a second shudder as the panel finally separated and fell away from the pod. The panel remained where it was, hovering in the vacuum, while the pod began to make its way back towards the planet, like it had been programmed long ago. Sid pressed himself against the window, his eyes looking out eagerly at the view. Before he had only seen a camera's eye view of space, but now he was able to look at it with his own eyes. Inside the pod, away from the dull roar of the rocket ship's engines, everything was serenely quiet. The only sound was the steady beep of the console and gentle hum of the pod's engines, along with the thudding of his heart. His head rolled as he gazed at the vast expanse of space laid out before him, looking up and down, left and right. He took it all in, adding yet more memories. Though the stars did not twinkle or flicker, they were incredibly beautiful. He wished he could have taken a picture, but no picture could possibly have compared with this. To his left, coming in steadily, he could see the planet. It was rapidly growing larger as the pod drifted towards it. It would not be long until the pod re-entered the planet's atmosphere, and they would once again be on solid ground. To his right was Meteor. Even Meteor seemed vaguely wonderful if frightening from here. Sid's breath caught in his throat. Space held wonders that were just as beautiful and just as amazing as any the planet could offer mankind. He returned his eyes to the stars.
So this is outer space.
The pilot breathed. His voice was barely a whisper, for he felt that any loud sound would somehow ruin the calm serenity of space.
Man. It's the real thing. I'm really here in outer space.
Before he returned to his seat, the pilot took one final look to his right. He watched as the Shinra number 26 flew steadily away from them, growing smaller and smaller as it headed towards Meteor. For a brief moment Sid felt a lump in the bottom of his throat. He swallowed it, and smiled fondly.
So long, Shinra number 26.
When the pod hit the planet's exosphere, sparks of light began to flicker around it and trail away like the embers of a fire. They passed through quickly and then hit the thermosphere. A wave of fiery red light swept over the escape pod until it became a glowing ball of light. The temperature outside the pod increased as they passed through, until the exterior glowed red hot. The pod rattled and clattered as it moved through the atmosphere. Those inside cast nervous glances at each other, except for Sid and Shara, who both sat calmly. The Shinra number 26, now devoid of its cargo and its crew, continued on its way towards Meteor. The rocket seemed so small and insignificant in comparison, yet it carried the hopes of all the people living on the planet. It flew right through the stormy flames that raged over Meteor's surface, and then collided. The ensuing blast was so intense and powerful that its effects could be seen from the planet. A bright light, emanating from the point of contact, swept out and engulfed Meteor until it became a ball of white light. It grew and grew, heading for the planet. In Midgar, the citizens gathered in droves outside of Shinra headquarters, waiting for news. Many had their eyes already turned upward, watching Meteor. One man stopped and pointed to the sky as a bright light erupted from Meteor. The light filled the skies, and the citizens were forced to shield their eyes as it fell over the city. The light stretched across the surface of the planet, reaching even as far as Cosmo Canyon. Those villagers who had dared to come outside stood and watched as the wave of light swept across the sky, blocking Meteor and even the clouds from view. In his hologram room, Bugenhagen floated silently before a hologram of the planet, with Meteor hanging just as silently above it. He had watched as events unfolded, and saw even the moment when the rocket had collided. Meteor erupted into flame, and Bugenhagen covered his eyes as a light filled even his hologram room. After a few moments of blinding intensity, the light began to fade. It retreated from the skies and the planet, and slowly but surely everything became visible again. The citizens outside of Shinra headquarters finally lowered their arms. They opened their eyes cautiously, and blinked in the sudden darkness that had been left in the light's wake. Then they remembered Meteor and looked up at the sky, believing that not even Meteor could survive such a blast. They looked up, and then cried out in horror and dismay. Meteor was still there. The rocket had collided with Meteor at the center of its outer shell. The front of this shell remained undamaged, but the rear had suffered massive damage. The shockwaves caused by the blast had ripped apart the outer shell, and large chunks of rock had broken away from the main body. They trailed behind Meteor, held in place by giant bolts of blue-white lightning that flashed from Meteor's inner shell. In spite of this, Meteor continued to move forward towards the planet. Silence fell over Cosmo Canyon. The villagers watching the spectacle were not surprised that the plan failed. Meteor was a thing of nature, and there was nothing Shinra could make that could rival the power of nature. In his room, Bugenhagen thought different, respecting both the powers of nature and man. Still, as he saw Meteor still hanging above the planet, he could not help but shake his head. In Midgar, the citizens were devastated. They fell to their knees and hit the floor with their fists as despair began to fill their hearts. Others hid their faces and cried openly. It seemed not even Shinra, the most powerful company on the planet, had the power to stop Meteor. Back on board the Highwind, Cloud stood by the main window and looked up at Meteor. It was only an hour past midday, but already the sky was turning red. Meteor's presence was affecting everything, it seemed. He turned his eyes to the west and looked at Meteor. It seemed smaller now that a large chunk of it had been blasted away, but Cloud knew that it would grow much bigger soon enough.
Rufus and the others' plan was a failure,
he said, shaking his head.
What a bust,
said Barrett.
But I kinda hoped it'd work.
Katshi lowered his head and kicked his feet gently against his mog's forehead.
We been both airin' them as much as we can,
he said miserably.
But there ain't no other way.
He scratched his furry chin, and then voiced everybody's thoughts by adding,
Wonder if we've been wrong all this time.
Red 13 shook his head.
Makes you worry, doesn't it?
He muttered. A gloomy silence fell over the bridge. Even the Highwind's crew fell silent, standing at their posts with somber looks on their faces. They had all worked so hard to interfere with Shinra's plans and get the huge materia, but they had not really thought too hard about the consequences of their actions. Meteor had been damaged by the blast, but if the huge materia had been on board, then maybe meteor could have been destroyed completely. Had their actions actually condemned the planet? Tifa tore her gaze away from the window and looked around at the downcast faces of her friends.
Don't worry,
she told them.
Think. Hey, the girl's right.
Sid left to the controls to his trainee pilot and rejoined the others. He looked round at them all and shook an accusing finger.
You start worrying and there's no stopping it. Things just start falling apart and get worse and worse. You're pretty damn optimistic.
Barrett crossed his arms.
You up to something?
Sid waved a hand dismissively.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this and that,
he said.
All the time we've been up here looking at the planet. I've been thinking even when we were floating in the ocean in that escape pod.
Cloud pressed his hand against the glass, his eyes still on Meteor. It was hard to remain positive in a situation like this. Already he could feel the beginnings of despair. It coiled in his stomach, like a serpent preparing to strike. He knew who should be standing in the center of the group, urging them all not to be sad. But she was not around anymore. Cloud sighed and turned from the window.
I've been thinking, too,
he said quietly.
About the universe. Planet. Ocean. How wide and big? No matter where I go and what I do, it won't change a thing.
Sid faced the swordsman and shook his head.
Maybe you're right,
the pilot agreed. Cloud's face fell and he turned away to look at the floor, while Sid looked around at the others.
But I came up with something different. I always thought this planet was so huge. But looking at it from space, I realized it's so small. We're just floating in the dark. Kind of makes you feel powerless. On top of that, it's got Sephiroth festering inside it like a sickness, the pilot continued. He shook his head again. That's why I say this planet's still a kid. A little kid sick and trembling in the middle of this huge universe. Someone gotta protect it. You follow me? That someone is us. Sid. That's beautiful,
said Tifa, gazing at the pilot with newfound admiration. Even Barrett was impressed.
Yo. Sid. You even got to me.
He said.
Now what? How are we gonna protect the planet from meteor?
They all looked at Sid expectantly, eager to hear his answer. The pilot slowly turned on the spot and scratched his head. Then, with everyone's eyes still on him, the pilot walked over to the wheel and sank onto the floor, his head down.
I'm still thinking about that.
That was that. Tifa shook her head as the moment that had gripped them came and went. The group separated and returned to their usual places on board the Highwind, thinking about what they could do in order to save the planet, except for Yuffie, who returned to her usual place on the lower deck and thinking about not throwing up. Red 13 padded softly down the steps to the lower half of the main deck, lost in thought. He sat on his haunches and sighed heavily. The way things were going, he would not be able to keep his promise to his grandfather, or to his father, Seto. To become a warrior true to his father's noble name, that had been his promise. What noble warrior would he be if he allowed the village his father fought so had to protect get destroyed by meteor? Suddenly the hound raised his head. His ears twitched. Did he just imagine hearing that sound? He rose to his feet and looked up, his ears turning this way and that, straining to hear.
Hey!
He said, blinking in confusion. The sound came again, so faint that it could barely be heard even with his hearing. Red 13 ran back to the others. His friends were still thinking hard, trying to come up with ways to save the planet. The hound barked sharply, drawing their attention.
Did you hear something?
Red 13 asked them. Everybody listened carefully as the sound came again, this time loud enough for all to hear. A pained, anguished cry sounded throughout the airship. It came apparently from nowhere but could be heard everywhere at once. The Highwind crew, hearing this for the first time, looked up in alarm.
The planet's scream. Or meteor.
Tifa whispered. She raised her eyes to the ceiling, remembering this cry. She had heard the same cry from deep within the life stream. That cry had been angry and full of hate. This cry, on the other hand, was the cry of something that was clearly in pain and reaching out. Tifa felt the cry resonate within her, and she placed her hand over her heart.
Is this the planet?
The others felt it, to an ethereal substance reaching out and touching their hearts. It was, like Sid had said, as though a child was reaching out to them and asking for help, crying in pain. Was the planet truly asking for their help? Was that even possible? It was scarcely believable.
Hey, how do we know that this is really the planet's scream?
Cloud asked, skeptical.
Did you forget?
Replied Tifa.
Bugenhagen told us.
Cloud folded his arms across his chest and nodded his head. He had forgotten about the old man, with his strange ability to float in the air. The old man was the elder of Cosmo Canyon, and probably the most brilliant and wisest man on the planet, even more so than some of Shinra's best scientists. It was only because of Bugenhagen that they knew anything about the life stream or the consciousness of the planet, and how the Mako reactors were steadily sucking the life out of the planet.
Bugenhagen,
Cloud muttered thoughtfully.
Let's go see grandfather,
interrupted Red 13. The hound leapt to his feet, his eyes glittering excitedly.
To Cosmo Canyon. I'm sure he'll be able to tell us something that will be helpful.
Cloud nodded in agreement. He had been thinking the same. Bugenhagen had been able to put them on the right track last time. Perhaps he would be able to help them out this time, too, when all other options were gone. The swordsman looked around to see if there were any objections. Seeing no objections from the others, he nodded at Sid. The pilot grinned and instructed his apprentice to make for Cosmo Canyon. The apprentice turned the wheel and the airship slowly turned to the east, heading back to the western continent. End of chapter.